Okay, morning everybody. Thank you everyone for joining us for our Collections Care live stream Q&A panel. This is the first time we've done this. I'm Sarah from Collections Trust. I'll just give you a wave just to make sure you can see which person's talking. I'm going to be hosting the panel, so I'll be asking your questions. We gathered a lot of questions in advance on various different themes, so I've amalgamated some of those and I'll be prioritising those questions, but I will also be monitoring our Twitter account, which is at Collection Trust, which hopefully you saw on the slide that I just put up, and I'll put that information up again at the end. So do let us know if you have an extra question, and I'll try and keep an eye on that, and hopefully we'll have time. We'll also be referring probably in our answers to some of our guidance that we've been gathering up in one place on the Collections Trust website. So again, we'll make sure you have a link at the end of this so that you can go and look at those pieces of information that we've been talking about. Once this live stream is finished, we will be posting it as a video so you can look back, and it will at that point as well be subtitled, so you'll be able to read, and we'll hopefully as well perhaps on our website supply that as a transcript for those of you who maybe don't have the time to sit and watch an hour. You can then read the answers as they've been responded to. So that was all I wanted to say before we introduce our lovely panel, apart from a big thank you to the Museum Development Network, who have provided our lovely panel of museum development collections care experts. So we'll do some introductions first, and then we'll dive into our questions. So I'll introduce everyone in order that I'm seeing them on my screen. So Anita, would you like to introduce yourself first? Oh, sorry, Anita, you were still muted.
For Museum Development East Midlands.
Do you mind just repeating yourself? We just didn't quite catch the start of it.
Yeah, sorry. Good morning. I'm Anita Hollinshead, and I'm the Regional Collections Advisor for Museum Development East Midlands.
Thank you, Anita. And Sarah.
Morning, everyone. My name's Sarah Hartshorne, and I'm the Programme Officer for Museum Development East Midlands.
Thank you. And Helena.
Good morning, I'm Helena Jaeschke. I'm the Conservation Development Officer for Southwest Museum Development.
Great, thank you. And finally, Libby.
Hello, I'm Libby Finney, and I'm the Regional Collection Care Development Officer working with Museum Development London.
Great, thank you everybody. So let's start with our questions. So we did have quite a lot of questions in relation to emergency planning, which I'm sure is no surprise to anyone watching or to our panel. So what I thought might be helpful is if we come to each of you one by one with your thoughts on what people might need to think about in relation to their emergency plans. So it might be that they're currently trying to implement their emergency plan, or maybe they are looking to revise their emergency plans as well in the in light of the current climate. So if perhaps we start with Libby, if you wouldn't mind starting first, and then we'll kind of open it up and go one by one through everyone's thoughts on that.
Okay, what do you want me to start with first? Which strand?
Which sorry?
Which strand of the questions would you like me to begin with?
Perhaps anyone who's maybe revising their emergency plan at the moment. Maybe if we start there.
Okay, well, I think there were quite a few people saying, asking how they could implement a plan in the current situation. And I think one of the things that we're certainly thinking about, the Museum of London, is who's going to be available on your call-out team. That may well have changed due to the current lockdown situation. So perhaps what you could do is go through the plan, check who's available to be on call-out, and if you can't get hold of enough people, think about who could then start being drawn in as new members. Mm-hmm. And then I think you could have a look at the plan and assess whether you are going to be relying on things like hiring equipment or popping out to a DIY store to buy extra supplies because you know you don't have enough. Is that going to be possible if an emergency happens in the current situation? If not, how can you get around that? Some people are concerned, I think, they can't get to their building, that other people will be there instead. So perhaps you need to find out who may be able to access that building, can you give them brief but relevant information? Don't overload them with a whole load of stuff. And I think also check that people that maybe carry out your CCTV or security, other aspects that would link into an emergency, check with them now how they are operating and how that might impact on you. If you have, for example, membership for Harwell, you might want to double check what's happening there. Get as prepared as you can, check that everything is in place and see how the current situation may affect that. And I think potentially as well, you might want to check with your insurers regarding cover and what might need doing in that respect.
Great, a very thorough answer. I'm just going to turn my webcam off just because I'm getting a poor internet connection. So I am still here. I'm just going to turn my webcam off just for a short time and see how that helps. But hopefully you can all still hear me. Give me a little nod if you can still hear me, panel. Great, excellent. So did anyone want to go next? Does anyone have anything to expand on, perhaps that Libby mentioned? Because that was a really thorough answer on emergency planning. But did any of you have anything to add to that? Yep, go for it, Anita. Make sure you unmute first.
Yeah, only as I say, it was a very comprehensive answer from Libby. Just to think about your salvage kits and your PPE and what you might not have in them at the moment and how you might get those at what is now quite a difficult time to purchase materials and equipment. But just to sort of bear that in mind as well, and certainly bear that in mind going forward, thinking about the future and what we might do to prepare for an event like this happening again, which hopefully it won't. Okay.
Great, thanks, Anita. That was a really good point, because I think I've seen a lot of very generous museums, I see Sarah waving her hand as well, have been donating some of their equipment as well to healthcare providers and other care providers. So I think that's a good point in terms of what equipment people might have available. Yeah, Sarah, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, that was a great answer and comprehensive. So I just wanted to make the point, we are in an emergency now. So actually people alongside their emergency plans also need to think about business continuity plans. So actually planning about the next kind of weeks and months to see how they're going to manage their museum staff, all those kind of things, thinking about those things and creating a business continuity plan alongside the emergency plan, I think is really important.
Yeah, great point. And last but no means least, Helena, do you want to jump in there?
Well, following nicely from everyone's progression, which has been beautifully kind of chronological, taking us through, what I'd like to look at is kind of, Sarah's led us into recovery. What I'd now like to look at is planning for the review stage, because obviously one of the things we're going to need to do after this is look at what worked, what didn't work, and how we need to amend and improve our emergency plans. So I think one of the things to remember now is to record what you're doing, to keep notes of what worked, what didn't work, how long things took, what contacts you needed, so that when you come to revise your emergency plan, you'll have all that information to hand.
Yeah, excellent point. Any final thoughts on emergency plans before we move on to our next question? Libby.
Sorry, I'm muting and unmuting. I know that somebody asked in a little more depth how they could go about supporting new members of their call-out team, because they had realised very early on that they wouldn't have sufficient people coming out, and whether there were online resources that they could pass on to those members. And I would say that there are some. For example, the Museum of London has an emergency planning online tool. However, I think if you've got new members coming on, it's very important to include them as part of a team, to try and talk to them directly or have virtual meetings with them as part of a team, not to overload volunteers with a lot of online articles or learning, perhaps initially, but more importantly, to outline the salient points of your plan, to make clear what would be expected of them should there be a call out, and to check that they would be able to do that and they'd be happy to do that. Mm-hmm. And I think then perhaps if you have got useful things in your plan, which include how to deal with wet artifacts in an emergency, perhaps you could run through those with them and make them feel part of that team. I think you will also need to check on a very regular basis that they're still available, because things are changing every day, and keep in touch with what the government updates and regulations are about lockdown and social distancing. I think the other thing is, it's actually bringing new people onto your team is a real opportunity, perhaps to have people with a different skill set. So find out what they bring to the team. What skills have they got that they can help you use, and perhaps different skills that you didn't know about, and think about how they can be fitted in, and then maybe go back to your current salvage, your emergency plan, and look at how you've allocated roles, because you might need to look at perhaps people with more collections handling experience being in supervisory roles. You might need to potentially, at this current time, change some of the roles around to take into account that you might have a very different team that's online. And I think look at it as an opportunity rather than something that perhaps is a last minute resort, and think very carefully about how you, as Helena said, how going forward you might want to continue with new team members or adapt them, the way that you manage call-out teams to take this into account.
Yeah, I think that's great points. I like the idea of looking at the opportunities, but also I'm sure in several of our answers we'll always make clear that it's really important to keep up to date with all of the guidance out there, whether it's the government advice or it's the kind of guidance on collections care issues specifically. So I think that's a really good point. Okay, so our next question, and I think Anita, if we can come to you first for this question. It was specifically around maybe staff or volunteers who are responsible for collections care activities, but perhaps they're only able to access the building and access the collections only quite periodically at the moment. So some people were asking what sort of things should they be doing if they're only able to access the building periodically, and then there'll be a follow-on question from that about whether if they can't get in at all, what they should do. So if we start with periodic access to the collections, what sort of things should people be doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first question, or the first thing to think about is, should they be going in at all? And also to think about how you can prepare your collections for a longer period of lockdown. The Museums Association posted an article yesterday about how can museums protect their collections during the lockdown. And they referred to the guidance on the ICON website and the Arts Council website and the Collections Trust website, which you talked about at the beginning. But their first focus was about security, because last week a Van Gogh painting was stolen from the Singelaaren Museum in the Netherlands, a painting that was on loan, and there have been some increased incidents of vandalism in museums in the UK since the lockdown. So that's one of the things to consider. The Arts Council guidance from DCMS says that it is confirmed that people can travel for work purposes and attend their place of work, but should only do so where that work cannot be carried out from home. This would therefore permit people whose attendance is necessary to provide security or to ensure the preservation of cultural objects to travel to their place of work. So that's a direct quote from that guidance, which was published on the 31st of March. But each museum has very specific circumstances and risks, and those risks might be around their volunteers and staff who might be doing that. So they need to make their decisions based on their own circumstances, but that guidance is quite helpful. Don't work on site without appropriate permissions, risk assessments or PPE. And if you're furloughed, you're not able to do any work for your employer, so just bear that in mind. So if you actually are able to get on site, the main things to check, and we discussed this yesterday, have a checklist, because you can feel very overwhelmed going in there cold. So have a checklist to make sure you don't feel that. Looking at evidence of pest infestation, checking your vulnerable collections such as wool and silk and natural history items, removing any rubbish, if there was any rubbish and waste left behind because you had to leave in a hurry, because that's to be food for pests. Checking and changing traps and quarantining any items that might show signs of infestation. Looking at your environmental monitoring equipment, seeing if there's any evidence of fluctuating temperature and humidity. Hopefully you've been able to leave some heating on if it was creating a stable environment. just recording your findings, perhaps changing silica gel and post-morb in your display cases, and emptying your dehumidifiers if that's appropriate. Looking for evidence of mould growth, looking for light, where that might be an issue, so closing, making sure shutters and blinds are closed, covering vulnerable collections, putting things that are on display back into storage, and the same goes for dust, covering things, putting things back into storage for the time that they're closed, if that's, if that's viable. Doing your usual checks around building issues, so looking for ingress of water, issues around fireplaces that can bring in dirt and water and birds' nests and all of those sorts of things, gutters, leaking pipes, trees, anything that might cause problems with your building. Security, checking that you've locked display cases and stores and that the keys are somewhere safe. Ensuring that alarms and CCTV are working if you have them, and checking windows and doors are secured. And then looking about scheduling some condition checks for collections. There's good advice on Spectrum on condition checking, also in benchmarks for collections care. And the Scottish Conservation Studio has a downloadable condition reporting tool that's free to download. So when you're looking at how you might prepare for closing the building, because you might get this one chance to go in and then you're not going to be able to go in for a while. If that's the case, look at turning off electrical equipment, but not your heating, your dehumidifiers or your alarms, or environmental monitoring if it's electrical. Possibly turning off water if that doesn't affect things like heating, but looking about emptying bins again and things, and anything that might cause be a risk in terms of arson, removing accumulation of posts, updating your risk assessment, checking again the outside of your building, your security is all working, reviewing your loans and contacting your insurers. I've thinking about reviewing emergency plans. We mentioned that in the last question as well. I think that's going to keep coming up. And I also just had some thoughts around some behind-the-scenes tasks which you might be able to do if you can access the building. So you might be able to do a benchmarks and collections care assessment or to update that. You may be able to do some documentation. If you can do some marking and labelling, there are some good short films on the Share Museum's website that give good training. There's just updating your plans and policies, potentially repacking collections if you've got the materials and equipment to do that. All the companies like Preservation Equipment and Conservation Resources have halted deliveries at the moment. Planning for reopening and looking at providing digital access to your collections and engagement activities digitally, so that people are still engaged with your site while you're closed. Some really good examples of that. And I know that Museum of London has listed those on their website. Some of those.
Great, another really thorough answer, thank you. I'll open that up in a second before we deal with the second part, but just to flag that you mentioned, Anita, it might be helpful to have a checklist or something ready to go, and that's something that this group of lovely people here are working on, and potentially coming up with something that we will put on our website that can then be adapted. So we haven't got a date for that yet, that's still sort of pending and working in progress, but that's a resource that might get added to that same core collections in lockdown section that I mentioned at the start. So thank you. So did anyone else have anything to add to that, if you're going in periodically, or if other people are going in periodically, what you can do? Sarah? Sorry, Sarah, do you want to go? Do you want to try now? Oh.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to make the point, and it's kind of segue into the next question, I think, about recording everything that you're doing when you're going in, so that you can reflect back on it and whatever's most useful for you in the way you work. So that might be taking photos of particular objects that you know are at risk or are starting to deteriorate, taking photos of areas where there might be mold growth, those kind of things, so that if it's not you going back in next time, the person before has a record, so that they've got something to compare it to. When we come on, we'll talk about insurance in a second, but you've got something to see what the situation is that's evolving. It's a really good handover practice. And also, you might be the collections person, but you might have to self-isolate. You might not be able to go in. That's something that you can pass over to any member of the team with that sort of thorough checklist. So I think that would be a really useful way of documenting how things are changing over the next weeks and months.
Yeah, that's a great point. I can see Libby has something to add as well. Go for it, Libby.
I would also say, think about how long you have when you're in the building and tailor your list to that. So I know you might have lots of initial worries because you might have been lying awake at night worrying about all the things you haven't done, but actually be realistic and make a list of just the most important things first and be realistic about the time it will take you to do them. Because there's nothing worse than spending ages on one thing and then having to leave the building and you've still got a lot of other things that you wanted to do, and then you're just going to go home and fret even more. So, think about apportioning what you want to do and the tasks to the time you might have available to do them, and be realistic about that, I think. Otherwise, it just makes it even more stressful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great point. So the second part of that question was, again, going back to maybe Anita first, could you say, because such a good answer to the first part, is if you're a collections care member of staff or volunteer, assuming that you're not furloughed, so you've got some work that you can do at home, what sort of things should people be doing if they can't get access to the collection at all, but they are at home wanting to do some work on that?
Well, one of the notes that I made was whether, even though you couldn't go in, whether there was anyone else who might be able to go in. So some security staff or non-collection staff who will be allowed access. So looking, and this really is the point that Libby just made about priority tasks. What are the absolutely essential things that they would need to do? And then how could we prepare them to do that? How can you prepare them to do that? What are those training needs? And again, about those not being overwhelming, but sticking to the priorities. I think Sarah's point about using photographs and visual prompts is a really, really good one. I think that would be hugely helpful. Just thinking about how you might be able to do those checks that we've just been talking about on those key areas, how you could do those if you couldn't get on site. If you've got a way of accessing your environmental monitoring data remotely, that's hugely helpful. I'm not sure that what percentage of museums would be able to do that. You could spend some time analysing environmental data that you have been able to collect and planning for what you'll do when you get back. So it's kind of very dependent on whether absolutely nobody can get in or whether somebody can, but they need a bit of support and guidance as to what to do and what to look for. And I think those visual prompts that Sarah talks about are really, really good idea for that, particularly around things like pest management and pest recording and so on. So and then just to sort of reiterate in terms of what you might be able to do, you could do a benchmarks assessment, or you could review your benchmarks assessment if you've already got one. You could do that without getting on site. You may be able to do something around your documentation records. You could potentially be looking at your online provision about ways to engage people with your site and your collection so that you're in their minds, even though you're not open. But also, I think sharing this experience, sharing this sort of care of collections in this situation, of course, sort of being mindful of whether there would be security issues about saying everything's shut and no one can get in, and just being cautious about that as well. So those were the sort of things I
Great. Fab, thank you. I'd like to move on to our next question now, which has been hinted at, I think, by a couple of speakers. Helena, if you don't mind, I'll just move on to the next question. We can always come back to you. Just conscious of time and getting through a few more questions. And we'll all have a chance to sum up at the end, I should have said as well. So the next question was possibly a relatively brief one. Sarah, if we could come to you with this one. How does all of this situation affect things like insurance, government indemnity cover? Has there been any guidance on those sorts of things?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have had quite a bit of anxiety. So there has been some recent Guidance Trust website now from Arts Council English advisor, particularly around the government indemnity scheme. But it's quite useful, I think, for anybody when you're thinking about insurance. Look, but really they've got 5 points scheme. So
sorry to interrupt you, Sarah. You might need to turn your
webcam.
Yeah, thanks. Just you're breaking up a little bit with audio. That might help a bit. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay. So is that any better?
Yes.
Yeah. So 5 points that they make is to maintain minimum staffing where possible, and then underneath that, if you can only go in every now and again, try and go in once a week. If you can't go in once a week as regularly, you can make it. If you can't go in at all, do what you can remotely, and as well, making sure you keep a record of all of those things, so that if ever you need to make a claim on insurance, that you have a record of when you've been in and what you've seen, or the fact that you haven't been able to go in. And with all of these, it's an ever-changing, evolving, and unprecedented situation. So it's just about having a dialogue with everyone. So with your insurer, do talk to them and tell them about the issues that you're facing, and look at the clauses in your insurance that might be void because of the situation, and discuss with them what that might mean and how you might present workarounds. And bear in mind, with insurers, the insurance industry, it's quite an unprecedented time with them. So it's just about being pragmatic and practical and talking to people and doing what you can, really.
Great. And I imagine, and the second part of the question was around if a loan is coming to an end, whether that is a incoming loan, an outgoing loan. I imagine the guidance would be similar around communication with the lender, with your insurer, whoever is, if the loan period is coming to an end during this period of lockdown. Would that be sort of similar advice, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. So think about who the stakeholders are for that loan, whether it's incoming or outgoing, and again, open up a discussion with them about what that means for them and for you, and what's a practical way forward. For everybody and every object, every loan, it's going to be quite a different situation depending on the timescales, how vulnerable the loan is, the workforce that's available at each site, if it's organisation to organisation. So treating it quite bespoke in a way for every loan that you've got, and starting those dialogues. And if you aren't able to go on site, but you do have access to those loan records, making sure that you keep them up to date, and just keep talking to everyone who it involves and it concerns, so that everyone has an understanding of where it's going, both in the immediate and then in the long term.
Yeah, great points. And good loan management is so much about good communication in both directions as well. So that in some ways isn't necessarily any different just because we're in this strange situation at the moment. So our next question, if we come to Helena, and then in fact, Helena, before I ask you this question, you did have something to add. So do you want to add it now, and then I'll ask you this follow-up question?
Oh, sure. Just very briefly, that point that several people have made, that if you can't get into the building, but other people can, great that you've sent them the records and that they've got the pictures in particular to look at to compare. But also, don't forget, you can use the technology the other way around. So if they're there with a phone, they can phone up and be showing you live what they're seeing, so you can be guiding them. So remind them to have a charged phone, torch, so that they can light up things, and then you can be present through your phone on site, helping people who aren't specialists.
That's a really good point, actually. And a lot of people have been doing loads of, like we're doing video chats, send each other videos, photos. That's a really, really good point. Excellent. Okay, so the question that I was coming to specifically around was a nice practical question about dehumidifiers. Exciting topic. So somebody asked that our humidifiers fill up really quickly at this time of the year, and I'm concerned that we can't go to the store to empty them frequently enough. Are there any workarounds beyond just buying bigger or more dehumidifiers? So Helena, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. Most dehumidifiers have, where the water drains into the tank and the tank's removable, there's actually a tube that sticks out that you can put a push-fit hose fitting on. So you can get a length of hose, and you can actually convert your dehumidifier from draining into the little tank, which, as you say, will fill up, to permanently draining. And you can run that tube down into a drain if that's possible. sometimes it's not possible where the dehumidifier is on the floor, but you can raise the dehumidifier up by putting it on a plank over a sink and having it drain into the sink that way. You can also put it up on a trolley and have a large carboy or plastic drum underneath and run the hose down so that it goes in and fills up the larger drum. Do think about that when you're setting that up, how you're going to empty the drum, because you're then going to have a very heavy object to move. So it makes sense to put the dehumidifier on top of a trolley and have the drum on the lower shelf of the trolley so that you can then move the whole unit somewhere where you can then decant the plastic drum into a drain or siphon it out into a drain. So that's one way around it, is to set up the dehumidifier so that it's got a much larger tank to fill.
Great. Anyone else anything to add on dehumidifiers? So I think one point, apologies, Helena, if you did mention this, I was having a look at some questions on Twitter. The first question I would probably ask is, does it need to be on in the first place? What's the worst that happens if it's not on? Because then you don't have any problem to deal with in the first place. So I'd ask myself that question. Do I need really to have it on? What are the risks, weigh up kind of the risks of having no dehumidifiers versus having to find some workaround or they fill up? And then if you do find that you do need them on, then that's fantastic, great practical guidance. Okay, so we had another, Sarah H, afraid we're going to come back to you. Another question related to accreditation. So I know that ACE put out a lot of guidance. If you're able to sort of summarise briefly, if you can, and pinpoint people to where that would be, on how people's accreditation status and accreditation returns might be affected or not during this period.
So museum accreditation has been put on hold. It's been paused till April 2021. So what that means for people who are fully accredited, so those that hold full accreditation or provisional, is that their current status will just be maintained for those 12 months. And then when we start again in April next year, the return schedule will catch up and it'll just be 12 months on. For those that are working towards accreditation, you're basically going to get a year-long extension onto your working towards time frame to make that submission, so kind of add a year on. And if you were supposed to be submitting during the next 12 months, then that's on pause and that'll be coming back online sort of past April 2021. One point I do want to make around accreditation is accreditation advice is still very much out there and available through museum development as well as online resources. So do have a chat to your local museum development team. If you are able to work from home, it's a really great time to look at your plans, policies and procedures. Great time just to kind of get those up to date and work on them. And just bear in mind that your forward plan at whatever point in the accreditation process you were in, even if you've just kind of got full accreditation and aren't ready to submit again for quite a few years, your forward plan is going to need updating because of the current situation. So that's something to keep aware of. And if you can, work on over this lockdown period and just try and maintain accreditation standards wherever is practical and pragmatic and access support as and when you need it, really.
Great, excellent. Any other thoughts from anyone on that accreditation notes? Yeah, but Libby, go for it.
I just wanted to add to what Sarah said about plans and policies, because I think sometimes there are quite a lot of them to do for accreditation, and sometimes there's the kind of feeling just to get them done, and then they do tend to sit on the shelf. But actually have a think about the situation we're in now and how really good plans and policies either are helping you or things that you could do to improve them so that if this happens again or a similar situation, those are the documents that you should be using to help get through this, you know, either through your emergency plan or your conservation collection care policy and plan. All of those sort of things should be documents that assist you, not just documents for accreditation purposes. So think how you've used them. Could you use them better? Are they great and they're a good example and you can share with others? Or are there things perhaps you could do to make them work harder for you should this situation arise again?
Yeah, great point. Next question. Again, I think a nice practical one, if we can come to Helena again for some nice practical advice first. We are looking for advice on dealing with pests during lockdown. And what do you recommend regards checking, as we don't currently have the collections team members going into the museum?
Right. This really couldn't have come at the worst time of year, at the worst time of year regarding pests, because now, of course, is the spring period when so many of the young adults are emerging, mating and laying eggs and starting fresh populations. So there's likely to be activity. If you have access to your previous records of pest checking, then it's a good idea to look at where the problem areas were last year. So where you could anticipate having problems this year, those might be your priorities if you have limited opportunities for access to your collection. If you can go in and check, please check your pest traps at least monthly. Be ready to put fresh traps out if necessary. You may want to concentrate on areas where you have particularly vulnerable parts of the collection that you know are likely to be under attack. One of the problems, of course, is that pests, as we know, tend to be discouraged when they're disturbed. And of course, with the museums being closed, there's going to be much less disruption and disturbance of pests. So there's a possibility that what normally would be quite a slow ingress of a population rise may suddenly become a much faster one under these conditions. So do be prepared for that. So as well as going in and checking the pest traps, and again, if you're not able to access the building or nobody who can identify pests can enter the building, then what you may need to do is have a second set of traps that the person goes in, collects the traps and puts numbered ones out to replace them, so that they can then hopefully leave them at your house and you can have the fun of checking them off at home. If they find things that they're uncertain of, again, they can show you on their phone. And don't forget that most phones are very good at microphotography, and that they can take real close-up photographs. But again, do remind them to take a torch with them, because the photographs will be much better quality if they're well lit. So identification is one thing, particularly checking vulnerable areas, but then planning for what you're going to do when you are able to treat them, so that you're ready to go in hard and fast and treat parts of the collection that might have been under attack. So what are your plans for treatment? Are you going to be freezing parts of the collection? Are you going to be quarantining areas where you're not sure if objects themselves have been attacked, although pests have been found in the area? So just being ready with the treatment plans, knowing who you need to call, what organisations. For example, if you've got a very large part of the collection that you're going to need to treat, do you need to hire a freezer truck to treat an entire large part of the collection? And what are you going to do about deep cleaning the areas when you come back to make sure that any remaining traces of pest infestation have been dealt with, and that areas have been appropriately cleaned?
Mm-hmm. Great, another great practical answer. Did any of the other panel have anything to expand on in relation to pests? Oh, Libby, yep, go for it.
Just a brief one. Don't forget the link to the English Heritage Pest poster on the Collections Trust website. Maybe now's the time to really try and get familiar with what pests actually look like, so when you get back, you'll feel a bit more confident about identifying them.
Yep, Helena?
Yeah, if I can come back on that, absolutely, it's the best resource we've got, but also excellent guidelines on the Collections Trust website. And a lot of the museum development organisations have been encouraging a wider range of people in museums to learn about pests and come to grips with them and recognise them to be able to deal with them. So, for example, Southwest Museum Development, we've been running a Pest of the Month in our newsletters just to encourage people to be more familiar with some of the nastier little things that we have around the museums.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, also there's the What's Eating Your Collections website, and also a really good book, which is, I think you can still get on Amazon, which is Pests in Historic Houses, Great and Small. It's a title, some assortment of words like that anyway, and it's really, really good, and it was published last year, and it's a really good introduction, even, you know, if you're completely new to the area of pests.
Great. So we're coming towards the sort of home stretch. So our sort of final question, and then there's another question on Twitter before we go around and summarise our final thoughts. How might we respond or be able to prepare to respond? And this sort of links back to what we were saying about emergency planning in some ways. How might we learn some lessons and be able to prepare for, hopefully we never have to prepare for a similar scenario, but that is potentially something that could happen, or something similar. How might we prepare and learn some lessons from that? So Anita, if we could come to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first thing, as you really just said, is to review the lessons that we've learned from this whole experience. So spend some time really reflecting on that. And then looking at the systems that we can put in place that would help us to deal with a situation like this more easily in the future. So one of those would be about reviewing and updating an emergency plan, particularly looking at that section on what to do if you can't access your building for a considerable period of time, and at business continuity planning, as Libby said before. Looking at whether remote access to environmental monitoring might be something that you could install for the future. Exploring ways of maintaining a stable environment whilst you were closed, if that wasn't something you were able to do. Looking at maybe your relationship with external contractors as well, and in terms of how you might manage that situation where staff and volunteers couldn't get on site, and updating your risk assessment, and also reviewing again your plans and policies, as has been said before, in line with what we've been experiencing. If you knew this was going to happen again as well, would what would you change, and would you make plans to move some of your more vulnerable or valuable collections items off site? And if you were going to do that, where were you going to put them to ensure that they were safe and the environment was appropriate? Things to consider. Ensuring that your digital museum is fit for purpose so that you can continue to provide some service, some engagement with people at a period of being closed. Looking at guidelines for social media to engage people while you're enclosed, while the site is closed as well. Resources for staff and volunteers who are going to be spending a long time working at home, things that will support them in doing that. Developing those training resources for non-collections people. So we know we're going to be sort of looking at doing that to a point whilst closed, but actually perhaps formalising that and looking at doing that as a team, as a group of people. Thinking about salvage kits, and I've already mentioned that again, but thinking about how to manage those in these sort of situations, and backups for computerised documentation, just making sure again that that's all in place. So those are my kind of initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, and you mentioned collections records. Collections Trust, we've had a survey up for a while now, trying to get a sense of if you work or volunteer in a museum, whether you have at home, if you are working from home, which majority of you are, whether you have access to the collections data, whether you can look at them just read only, whether you can edit them. So I think that survey is still open. So if any of our viewers, as it were, in the UK haven't responded to that yet, that'll be really useful information for us to maybe put some action points together again as a team. So going back to planning and preparing maybe for a similar thing in the future, did anyone else have anything to add to that for Anita's answer? Yes, Sarah.
I just wanted to add two things. One linked to your suggestion just then, in that Arts Council have an email address specifically at the moment to report kind of big issues from museums. So if you have kind of big collections issues, I'd really recommend dropping that email a line, just so that we can start to get a picture nationally of what everyone's challenges are. And the second thing I think I would state, and I don't think this is museum specific, about preparing for this kind of incident in the future, is I think you can react well as long as you can communicate effectively with your team. So it's really important to have a way that you can communicate with your staff and volunteers quite quickly and accessibly, whether it's a platform like this or email or whatever that might be. I think that's really crucial, because if you can communicate effectively, you can start to plan effectively together, and it really is a collective effort, both on a micro level in a museum, regionally, nationally. It's about all working together and having those clear channels, I think.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I mentioned this or not, but I think what we've probably learned from this time as well is what you need to be able to access in order to work from home at a time like this. So if those things weren't accessible, it's about making sure they would be for the future.
Yeah, great point. So before we do our final sort of round summary from everyone, somebody on Twitter mentioned, I can't find it now, but I did note it down. Perhaps if any of us, it's not my area of expertise, and it's fine if it's none of our areas of expertise either, but it's worth asking for some clarification on furlough, because I imagine if there was an emergency, anyone who responds, that would be classed as work. Is that correct? Anyone? Sarah, you're nodding. Are you happy to respond if you're able?
Nodding in the sense of I think that's something that hasn't been worked through in the guidance. So yeah, we're not HR specialists, but AIM, the Association of Independent Museums, have got some brilliant access to HR advice, because I think in those instances it really does need to be understood. I know today there's some discussions on the Arts Council website whether MPO staff can be furloughed, and there's lots of things, because it's completely new, that we just need to work through. So my advice there would be try and think it through before the emergency happens. So if you're not sure, like we aren't here now, and I'm kind of taking a note to go back and look at the HR guidance, speak to specialists to get the answer to those questions so that you're confident when the issue does arise, along with emergency planning, what the process is going to be.
Yeah, that's a great advice. Look at the guidance. Okay, great. So I think that was the only sort of question we had on Twitter. We've got lots of nice feedback and people tweeting, but I think that was the only question. So I think I found them all. So in our last 10 minutes or so, because I think that's how much we've got left, yes, I think it'd be nice to go around one by one and just give any final thoughts. Maybe you want to reiterate something, or maybe you forgot to answer, to mention something in a particular answer. Just some final thoughts from everyone, and we'll go round in a particular order. So Anita, if you're happy to give us your final thoughts first.
Sorry. When we looked at the questions that came through and the themes that came through, they were very much around specific things, and those were around emergency planning and how you could ensure that your emergency plan might be fit for purpose. They were very much about what can I do if I can't access my building and I can't access the collections, or if I can, and it's for a very limited period of time, as the point that Libby made. Be pragmatic and practical. What can you actually achieve? What are those priorities? And I think being able to work those out at home and outside of that working environment, so that when you do go in there, you're as calm as you can be in a difficult situation, and you've got that list, that checklist to hand to make sure that sort of make sure you don't forget anything. But it is very much about the priorities. We can't do everything that we would normally do, so it's very much about prioritising and learning from this for the future. Really, that it's hard, but it will be. At least we can learn from it for the future.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Anita. Helena, if we could come to you next for your final thoughts.
Okay, two brief things. The first one is, as we've mentioned several times already, do take the time to record what you're doing, record your thoughts about it, what's working, what isn't working. This is going to be really helpful afterwards. And I've never found an occasion when somebody said, you know what, I kept too many records of what I was doing in a particular project or situation. And the second one is that although for many of us this is very shocking and very worrying, to remember that many of the smaller museums are closed for 6 months of the year routinely. And although, to be fair, yes, people are going in during the winter, they're preparing for their exhibitions, there's a certain amount of work going on. Actually, the objects are going to survive. Try not to worry about them too much, and do take care of yourselves. So do make sure that you're in the best possible condition when the museums are opened up and we are able to go back into them.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Helena. Libby, final thoughts.
Well, I would echo Helena. Don't worry. I think use that energy positively, because there's a lot you can do now. So revisit your emergency plan. Keep in touch with your staff and volunteers and colleagues. Work together, as Sarah said, communicate, because everything joins together. It's not all standalone. There are great links on the Collection Trust website, guidance on what to do. So maybe if you are worrying about something, the answers will be there that can help you. Use this time to plan ahead, because you will be able to do things when you get back in. But if you've got a clear, calm plan of action, you've liaised with your colleagues, and when you get back, you know what you're doing, then I think that will make it less stressful and probably far more effective at dealing with some of the issues you might be facing.
Great, thank you, Libby. And Sarah, some final thoughts from you.
Yeah, just to echo what everyone said, really, is that this is a very anxious time, both from a personal level and in a work level. So understand that you only have serve influence changing. So do what you can, but don't be about museums and collections. And just, do what you can, and don't be alone. I wanted to say, I know a lot of staff have been furloughed, and lots of people are feeling therefore very out of touch with the museum sector when things are rapidly changing and evolving. So, if you want to watch things like this and look after your CPD, sign up to newsletters, go out there, you're not alone. And if you're not furloughed, reach out to the museum development team. We're here to help. Some of us are running online training, but also we're at the end of a phone. We have grant support and advice support. So don't struggle alone. Everyone's facing unprecedented issues, and we can put you in touch with other museums and provide whatever support that we can. And the last point I wanted to raise is one thing we haven't kind of touched on, is that for some museums, this is critical financially. So actually one of the biggest risks of their collection is that around the museum and keeping finances afloat. So again, think about your business continuity planning, whatever stage you're in. Make sure that you're looking at all angles there of where the risk is. Again, access museum development support to help you with that issue. And stay positive, everyone.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way to summarise the fact that the sector is being, it's always been so welcoming, so collaborative, and everyone's kind of working together and doing lots of things like this. So I think that's a really positive thing that we can take from this. And I think this might be a format, whether it's on this exact topic or whether it's on other topics, that will probably repeat throughout this period as well. And that seems to be echoed on the Twitter comments. People seem quite up for doing more stuff like this. So I think that's a real positive. I'm just going to share a last slide, our contact information on our website. So hopefully everyone can see that. So thank you everyone for joining us. All of you who've joined us live and who've been tweeting. And also thank you as well to everyone who's going to watch this once it goes up as a recording. And a final thank you to our lovely panel and to the Museum Development Network as a whole, who've been brilliant at kind of pulling together all of these various pieces of guidance and advice, and this panel as well. You do amazing work. So up on the screen you have our website, www.collectiontrust.org.uk, and our Twitter is at Collection Trust. And if you have any thoughts on maybe any feedback on this session, for example, or if you've got any ideas for what might be helpful in terms of future online sessions, if you drop me an email at events@collectionstrust.org.uk, that would be great. Or maybe you've got some ideas for some resources, or want to share some resources that you've maybe put together. Maybe you've already done a checklist like we were mentioning, then it'd be great to hear from you all. And I'll just put us back in the middle of the screen just for a final wave goodbye. So thank you everybody, and I'll speak to you all soon. Thank you.